decide to let you go.
What's up guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I thought I could try to do a voiceover workout to explain some cues and form tips that help me through these glute and hamstring exercises. I've never done a voiceover before, so bear with me, but let's just get right into it. First, you always want to start off with some dynamic stretching to get the blood flowing, but most importantly, so we lower the risk of injury during our lift. But I'm just going to skip through most of it just for the sake of time, because honestly, it can just be kind of boring to sit here and watch someone stretch. But I do these stretches for about 5 to 10 minutes. I do always like to include some bodyweight lunges, whether that be reverse or walking. Then I like to do whatever you want to call these, let's just say frog squats, I guess. And then I just do some side kicks as well to just open up my hips. So every time I train glutes, I always start off with some hip thrusts. So when it comes to foot placement, a good rule of thumb is to just bring your heels and align them to where your knees would sit when your legs are straight out in front of you, and then slightly point your toes outwards. I typically do prefer to do hip thrusts with just a barbell and free weights, but unfortunately my gym doesn't really have a great location or area to do those. So the next best thing is I choose to do them on the Smith machine. So if you're doing them this way or with a barbell with a bench of any kind, I like to make sure that my back is on the bench about where the end of my sports bra hits. And then I also want to make sure that my chin is tucked and that you want to engage and squeeze your glutes throughout the entire movement. Think of it as you're trying to bring your glutes or your hips straight up to the ceiling above you. Next, we are going to be doing glute-focused RDLs. With these, I like to make sure that my feet are about shoulder width apart from each other. And then I want to make sure that my hips are kind of stacked underneath me, just to make sure that I have a neutral spine while performing this exercise. And please, for the love of God, do not pick up your weight with an arched back, because we do not want to be hurting our backs before we even begin. And with these, I like to do 1 to 2 warm-up sets before I get into my working sets, just so I can feel out the weight. I also typically do these with a barbell as well, but lately I have been doing them on the Arsenal hammer strength just because it gives me a little bit more stability. And I like to make sure that I'm not rushing through this movement as fast as humanly possible just to be able to lift the weight. I want to make sure that I am performing it slow and controlled so I can really feel that mind to muscle connection. Another good tip for these is that you don't necessarily have to come up the entire way when you finish the rep. I'm not gonna lie, I do forget to do that all the time, and it is something I have to work on. But this does allow for less back pain as well as keeping the tension in your glutes the entire time. As for form cues, one major one is to bring your hips straight backwards. Think of it as you're trying to close a door with your butt if your hands are full of groceries. And then you want to think the same for your knees. You don't want your knees to go in front of you. And then you also want to keep a slight bend in your knees if you're trying to target your glutes during this movement. If you wanted to target more of your hamstrings, you would do it more with a stiff leg. And you want to think of this movement as a back and forth one rather than up and down, because you really want to use your glutes and squeeze them on the way back up and not use your back to do all of the work. And like I said before, you want to make sure you have a neutral spine throughout the entire time. Then I moved on to some seated hamstring curls. Now, there aren't a bunch of things to keep in mind while doing these, but one major thing that I may do differently than other people is you can see that I'm kind of leaning forward instead of having my back pushed up against the seat. I do this because not only do I feel a better stretch, but typically when people put their backs up against the seat and just load up the weight, people tend to arch their backs while doing this to help with momentum to finish the reps. But this is just going to give you back pain and isn't really helping you. And I just think it takes away, honestly, from the whole movement. And you want to make sure you aren't rushing through these either. You want to have a nice controlled negatives on the way down. Next, we are doing the leg press. Now we are focusing on targeting our glutes and our hamstrings, so I did place my feet slightly higher than you typically would and spread out and have my toes pointed just slightly outwards. Now, I do want to make sure that I'm getting my full range of motion, but one thing that people typically do wrong with this movement is that they'll bring their butts off of the seat, and once again, this can create unnecessary back pain. And I also think it just is taking away from the movement. While range of motion is super important, if it does cause you to come up off of the seat, I would maybe think about changing where your foot placement is first. And maybe that will help to get you that full range of motion that you are looking for. Or if that doesn't help, you honestly might just have to work on your hip mobility or just stretching. And my legs were shaking at this point, and yet we still have 2 more movements. Next, we are moving on to glute-focused hyperextensions. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this exercise honestly pisses me off half the time I do them, but that's just because I kind of struggle with feeling this exercise in my glutes. But it's so normal not to be perfect all the time. And some exercises might not work for everybody. Everybody's body is different. And just because somebody says that something will absolutely grow your glutes doesn't mean that's true for everybody. But I actually changed one thing of how I did them today, and I actually felt a better connection in my glutes. So instead of rounding my back like a lot of people will say to do, I actually kept it more neutral and focused on kind of hip thrusting into the pad. I also kept my chin tucked as well as my toes pointed outward. And you also want to make sure your calves are pushed up against the machine back pads. Now on to our final movement, which is cable kickbacks. Now there are several ways you could go about doing these. I typically like to have my non-working foot angled a little bit outward while my working foot is at about a 45-degree angle. And I like to think that there is a little square that is below my feet. So while my non-working leg is pointed toward the top right of that square, my working leg starts by pointing at the upper left corner of that square and is kicking towards the lower right corner of that square. I just think that's the best way to describe what I'm trying to do with my feet cues during this movement. Now, one thing that people will do wrong is actually leaning too far forward. You want to have a slight lean forward, but not a dramatic one, because again, that's just going to cause lower back pain. So I do like to grab onto the cables in front of me for more stability. And you shouldn't be using your body to use full momentum into your kickbacks. You want your glutes to be doing most of the work. And when you kick back, you also don't want to go too far because then you're just going to lose the tension in your glutes. But that's it for this workout. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next video.
It's hard to let you go.